Perfectionism might feel like it's helping you, but what if I told you that it's actually the barrier to everything that you want in life? If you've ever held yourself back from your biggest goals and dreams because you felt like you had to be perfect first, then this video is for you. I want to share why perfectionism can be so damaging, as well as the strategies that I've used in my own life to break free from the trap of perfectionism. I put off launching my blog for years because I didn't feel good enough or ready. And now, even with this YouTube channel, I sometimes find myself back in that exact same headspace, doubting myself, comparing myself to others, and sometimes feeling really stressed and overwhelmed. Now, the irony is not lost on me that I talk about intentional living, but I want to acknowledge that I'm not perfect and I'm still working through a lot of these things as I'm talking about them. If you enjoy this content today, then please do like, comment, and subscribe. It really means a lot to me and it helps my content to be found by more people. So yeah, it's really appreciated. Perfectionism often comes from a fear of failure, of making mistakes, or of not meeting the expectations of other people. You might feel like your worth depends on how well you perform or what you achieve. And I think this is especially common if you grew up in a household where you felt pressure to succeed, whether that was academically or in any other way. I was always an A-star student, which is great on paper, but I did always feel a lot of pressure to perform. And I think this is really where it becomes problematic when you start to tie your worth to your external achievements. It eventually becomes hard to accept anything less for yourself than perfect, which can easily lead to burnout, procrastination, or even avoiding tasks altogether. And then I think if we just go a layer underneath that again, is a need to feel in control of situations and to not be judged by other people. So feelings of maybe humiliation, embarrassment, and shame really are at the core of what perfectionism is trying to avoid. There's nothing inherently wrong with wanting to do our best. I think that's a normal thing to feel and it can be healthy. The main problem that I see with perfectionism, and especially within myself, is that it actually stops you from growing into the person that you want to be. Because by its very nature, transformation involves taking risks, making mistakes, and failing. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is this really is your wake-up call, because I promise you that your best self is on the other side of perfectionism. You can really only overcome perfectionism when you want to grow and improve more than you fear making mistakes and potentially embarrassing yourself. The first point is really a self-awareness piece, and that is becoming aware of your inner critic. That little voice that is saying all sorts of mean and nasty things to you that you would never say to someone else. For me, that is thoughts like, this isn't good enough, you should be better, this is a complete disaster. One of the things I find it helpful to do when confronting this inner voice is to try and externalize it. You might imagine that they're sat next to you on the sofa and you're talking to them, and these are the kind of things that they're saying back to you. And I just wonder how long we would actually sit there and tolerate that from someone. I also find it really helpful to ask myself the question of, would I say this to a friend? You know, if I had a friend and they were telling me about their new YouTube channel, it would not even cross my mind to say to them, this isn't good enough, or, you know, you're not as good as that person. I actually think my first thought would be like, that's really courageous. But it's funny how even though we know that we would say that to a friend, that isn't the voice that we speak to ourselves in. So I really try to reframe that now. The second point sounds really obvious, but it's something that I have to remind myself of all the time, and that is to run my own race and stop comparing myself to other people. It's really easy to look at what other people are doing and just assume that they were born perfect, or they were born with this kind of confidence or knowledge or like ability. And I think for me, it's remembering that everyone started somewhere, and I may be comparing my start to someone else's middle or end. If I'm comparing, for example, my first blog post or my first video to someone else's 300th. It's just such an unfair test. So focus on your own growth, and really what you should be comparing yourself to is where you have come from, not where that other person is. So if you can say, yeah, I made a 1% improvement there, or I did that a little bit better, that is what is most important in that situation, because you are growing and you are learning. That's all that you can ask from yourself. My next point is something that I find really hard to accept sometimes, but that is to set more realistic standards for myself. I find that perfectionism often leads to procrastination, and if I can't do something perfectly, then I will just avoid doing the thing at all. So I try to tell myself that I can aim for 70% and that is okay. Like, my 70% is often other people's 100% because of how perfect I feel like I have to be all the time. This doesn't mean not having any standards at all. It just means accepting good enough. Which brings me on to my next strategy, which I think is probably the most important, and that is to take imperfect action, even if you don't feel ready or prepared enough. It's really easy, especially for my personality type, to stay in a mode where you're just consuming a lot of content, or you're trying to put together the perfect plan, but you're not actually involved in any of the work of doing the thing itself. You feel like you're learning a lot and you feel like you're being productive, but in reality, you're not really moving forwards. There's a study that I heard about once that really hammers this point home for me. That was a photography experiment where there was a class of students that were split into two groups. One was told to take as many photos as possible and focus on quantity, whereas the other group was told to focus on taking the best possible photo and focus on quality. At the end of the experiment, it was the group that was focused on quantity where all the best photos came from. And that is because they were actually involved in the process of learning how to take good photos, as opposed to the group who were stuck in tutorial hell and focused so much on quality that they were over planning and over preparing and never actually in it working out what really worked in practice. It reminds me of something that I heard Ali Abdaal say, and that's that your early efforts should embarrass you. But if you can just accept that your first 10 to 20 attempts at something are going to be bad, like they're literally going to suck, but that is okay, and that is a necessary part of the process that you have to go through to get better at something. You can overcome the perfection trap. This video is really my version of taking imperfect action, because there's been times where I've literally been like, it's okay, I'm not going to do a video this week, nothing's working, and just making all these excuses. But it's only through the process of doing and of showing up and doing it anyway, despite my fears of failing, of not being perfect, of making mistakes, that I'm going to learn and I'm going to get better. That matters so much more than something polished or perfect. And yeah, I hope, if nothing else, that you can take that from this video. And finally, if I am still struggling to take imperfect action, then there is one last thing that is so powerful that I always take the time to remind myself of. The Stoics had a phrase called Memento Mori, which means literally, remember you will die. I know that might sound really morbid, quite bleak and depressing, but it's actually intended to have the opposite effect. When you get really clear that your time on this earth is finite, then it gives you much more motivation to push yourself and just go and do the things that you really want to do, no matter how you're feeling about it. This kind of reflection is uncomfortable, but it's also incredibly clarifying at the same time. For example, imagine what people would say at your funeral, or what you would want them to say. What kind of life would you like to have lived, and what kind of legacy would you like to leave behind? Perfectionism tricks us into thinking that we have all the time in the world and that we need to just keep learning or doing that little bit more before we can begin. And it simply isn't true. Always remember that life is short, and The cost of waiting is that you might actually never end up living the life that you knew you were capable of living. I don't know about you, but I find that a truly terrifying thought, and sometimes you need fear to motivate you, because fear is actually a lot more powerful than wishing and wanting and hoping. You need that stick alongside the carrot to get you moving sometimes. Think about the consequences of if you don't go after those things and if you don't pursue the things that you wish you had done, because you don't want to look back on that with regret. So if you're feeling overwhelmed or stuck in perfectionism, then I guess I just want you to know that it's okay to show up and be seen in all of your imperfection. Let's really normalize trying before we're ready and showing up imperfectly and being really okay with that. Thank you so much for being here. If you've got to the end, I really appreciate you sticking with this, and I hope you found it helpful. I'll see you in the next one.